Two federal courts offer opposing rulings about a key aspect of Obamacare. Now what? This is Special Report. Good evening, I'm Brett Baer. Two federal courts took on the IRS rule extending federal subsidies to states that didn't set up exchanges for Obamacare. The decisions went in opposite directions. One tossed out the rule and the other said it was okay. The White House, meanwhile, is promising business as usual. To sort this all out, we have Fox team coverage tonight. Jim Engel looks at the potential ripple effects if the subsidies rule is thrown out. Ed Henry has the story of how the administration took the decisions about a major domestic issue while dealing with two serious international matters. But we begin with correspondent Shannon Bream on the cases themselves. Hi, Shannon.
Hello, Brett. Well, at stake now are those subsidies for Americans in more than 30 states. Money that, if it was to disappear, would give millions an argument that buying health insurance would be too great a hardship, potentially triggering millions of exemptions from the individual mandates. One issue, but two federal courts with very different opinions. This morning, the D.C. Circuit, which sits just one step below the U.S. Supreme Court, tossed out the administration's interpretation of the Affordable Care Act, which used an IRS regulation to extend subsidies into states that have not established their own exchanges, despite critics' arguments that the plain language of the law doesn't allow for that. In a 2-to-1 decision in the Halbig v. Burwell case, the court agreed, saying, quote, "Our duty when interpreting a statute is to ascertain the meaning of the words of the statute, duly enacted through the formal legislative process."
Just last week, I told Congress that Halbig was a live torpedo in the water for Obamacare, and that torpedo just hit.
Just a short time later, the Fourth Circuit, and equal to the D.C. Circuit, issued its own ruling on the issue, holding that where it found the law to be ambiguous, it defers to the IRS interpretation. Quote, "We are satisfied that the IRS rule is a permissible construction of the statutory language."
And the Fourth Circuit made clear today that when you look at the statute as a whole, then the administration's position must prevail.
In each of the circuits, the losing parties can petition for a hearing before all of the judges that sit on the respective courts. In D.C., that would include 3 new Obama appointees, rushed onto the court after Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid changed the rules for getting the president's nominees confirmed.
He hasn't had a chance to pack the Supreme Court completely yet, though, so I am confident that the Supreme Court will have the last word.
And over the last several months, the Supreme Court has handed this administration numerous defeats in cases where it's decided that the president or a federal agency has used its power to go around the law. And Brett, that is exactly what the IRS is accused of doing in this case.
Okay, Shannon, thank you. There are still many unknowns, but if the Halbig case is affirmed, what would that mean? Chief National Correspondent Jim Engel looks at how Obamacare would unravel.
The D.C. decision, if affirmed, throws millions of people receiving subsidies in the federal exchanges into limbo, raising questions about how well Obamacare could function.
The D.C. Circuit has spoken and saying this was against the law and you can't do it going forward. It's a different world for the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare than it was yesterday.
The court found the plain language of the statute, quote, unambiguously restricts the subsidy to insurance purchased on exchanges established by the state. But 86% of those in the federal exchanges get subsidies, and now many of them will find insurance too expensive.
Then that means individuals out there who would be getting the subsidies are now going to have to pay the whole premium themselves.
The law, however, says no one is subject to the individual mandate if coverage costs them more than 8% of their income.
So once you take the subsidy out of the picture, the insurance is very likely, given the extent of the subsidies, to exceed 8% for many of these individuals.
So they'd no longer be covered by the individual mandate. The ruling also blows a hole in the employer mandate, with the court majority saying, quote, the employer mandate's penalties hinge on the availability of credits. If credits were unavailable in states with federal exchanges, employers there would face no penalties for failing to offer coverage. And if millions of individuals and employers don't face a mandate or penalties, Insurance companies may face a very different market.
Part of the idea of participating on them is that you're going to have a pretty wide group of folks who will be buying your products, and you'll be getting federal subsidies for them along the way.
Though this decision is clear, the next steps are not. For one thing, what happens to the money already spent on subsidies?
I can't believe that in our political system, anyone in Washington wants to take money back from low-income people who just did what the government told them.
So what to do? Miller says without subsidies, officials will be at a loss.
It would be time to go back to the drawing board.
Though the final outcome is not certain, critics say the court's decision made one thing clear: how sloppily crafted the law was, requiring one court after another to interpret its intent. Brett?
All right, Jim, thank you. Now to Chief White House correspondent Ed Henry with a look at a president who's dealing with an image problem on several fronts.
As President Obama jetted off for 3 days of fundraising on the West Coast, Republican leaders declared it's time to shift focus away from the midterms after the president was fundraising last week as the jetliner was shot down over Ukraine and tensions exploded in Gaza, and the week before in Texas as the border crisis flared.
What I think the president has failed to do is the job he was paid to do, which is to lead the country, and where legislation is necessary, to engage with those who actually pass legislation.
The president did stop at the Dutch embassy today to remember the victims of the downed jetliner before leaving for his first fundraiser in Seattle.
Extend on behalf of all the American people our deepest condolences.
And White House aides note the president brings all the trappings of office with him on the road to fulfill his role as commander-in-chief.
What about the president's time? What about the fact that there's 5 work days this week and 3 of them he's fundraising?
Well, I think I will hazard a guess that a significant portion of the president's time each of those days will be dedicated to participating in the presidential daily briefing, getting updates from his national security team about the situation on the ground, making phone calls to world leaders.
Even as they insist it's not an optics problem, there are signs White House aides realize the criticism may be sinking in. They canceled an expected appearance on Jimmy Kimmel's late-night talk show for Wednesday in Los Angeles that may have been seen as too jocular as challenges pile up. The latest being today's early court ruling, raising new doubts about the president's signature domestic achievement.
There continues to be chaos and confusion around the president's health care law. But when you first have to pass a law before you get to find out what's in it, and you have a law that is terribly written and awful in its implementation, what you see is more confusion for Americans.
White House aides shot back the second court ruling later in the day, shows partisan attempts to repeal the law continue to fail.
It is pretty clear, even to those of us that don't have a fancy legal degree, that the intent of Congress was to ensure that every eligible American would have access to tax credits that will lower their health care costs.
Now, Josh Earnest also said if it becomes clear there's something the president can't do from the road to stay on top of these crises, they'll alter the schedule again, cut short this fundraising trip, and get him back to Washington sooner. Brett?
Ed Henry live on the North Lawn. Ed, thank you. Stocks were up today. The Dow gained 62. The S&P 500 added 10. The Nasdaq finished ahead 31. Up next, we go to Ukraine and Gaza City for the latest from the ground in those war zones. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates across the country are covering tonight. WTXF in Philadelphia with the search for suspects in an Atlantic City casino heist. 2 suspects made off with $180,000. Police so far haven't released any additional details. NYW New York is covering an investigation into a major security breach at the Brooklyn Bridge. White flags, which are international symbols, of course, of surrender, were flying in place of American flags, which normally appear there. No word yet on why, but officials are taking the matter seriously. And this is a live look at St. Louis from our affiliate KTVI. The big story there tonight, a big sale. The iconic world's largest ketchup bottle could be yours for $500,000. Residents of Collinsville, Illinois, fear they are losing their community's most famous landmark. But before you pull out your checkbook, you should know the owners will neither confirm nor deny the existence of real ketchup inside that bottle. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway. From Special Report, we'll be right back.